Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Diatlov Pass incident, a favourite of horror fans on YouTube. What you may not have heard, though, is the equally disturbing and still unexplained Hamar-Daban Pass incident, sometimes called the Buryatia Diatlov Pass. On August 5th, 1993, a team of mountaineers were trekking through the Hamar-Daban mountain range in Siberia. The expedition was made up of 7 people and was headed by Ludmila Korovina, a seasoned hiker with tons of experience. Joining her were 24-year-old Tatiana Filipenko, Denis Vachin, Vika Zalasova, Timur Bapanov, Valia Utachenko, and 23-year-old Sasha Krisin, who Ludmila had effectively raised and thought of as her own son. The young group set off on the morning of the 2nd, as did several other hiking groups in the area. Unfortunately, although good weather was predicted, the team were blasted with freezing cold rain and snow. This didn't dissuade them from continuing, however. Like I said, the group was young and eager to prove themselves to Ludmila, whom they all looked up to. Ludmila didn't go easy on them either, and along the way made some questionable decisions. On the night of the 4th, for instance, she had the group set up their camp on a slope about 4 kilometers away from the nearest forest. There was a thunderstorm raging that night, and this area was completely unprotected from the elements. Given her mountains of experience in, well, mountaineering, you'd have thought she would have chosen to camp elsewhere. The next morning, it happened. As the group packed up their things and descended down the mountain, Sasha suddenly began bleeding heavily from his nose, ears, and mouth. He fell to the ground and was dead within moments. This happened so suddenly that everyone else was left dumbfounded. Sasha was strong, healthy, and hadn't complained of any pain up until that moment. What had just happened? Most distraught was Ludmila herself. Like I said, Sasha was like a son to her. She ordered everyone else down the mountain while she stayed with the body. They followed her instruction and started walking. No more than a minute later, however, they heard Ludmila shouting to them for help, saying that she couldn't move. They rushed back to see what was wrong with her, only to find their leader sprawled out on the ground beside Sasha, blood gushing out of her face. The rest of the group were horrified. 2 of their team, who were apparently healthy that morning, had just perished in front of them in the blink of an eye. They started to panic, terrified that the same thing was about to happen to them. Well, it did. Valia Utachenko, the group's only survivor, explained what happened next. Moments after discovering Ludmila's body, Timur and Vika began tearing at their clothes, fell to the ground, and started twitching and foaming from the mouth. In Valia's words, Dennis began to hide behind the rocks and run away. Tatiana was banging her head against the stones. Vika and Timur probably went mad. Valia tried to help Vika, the youngest female in the group, but when she did, the girl bit her. Dennis and Valia were the only 2 group members still unaffected by whatever was happening. They both began to run at full speed down the mountain. Dennis told Valia to take out the essential items from her bag, abandon the rest, and run as fast as she could. She started rifling through her belongings, but by the time she looked back up at Dennis, he was lying on the ground, bleeding from every orifice. Alone and terrified, she sprinted off. Now, without any provisions and still far from civilization, she was forced to sleep alone in the forest at the bottom of the mountain, all through the freezing night. The next morning, Valia made her way back up the slope to look for survivors, and came upon a scene of pure carnage. All of her young co-hikers were dead. For 3 days, the 17-year-old wandered through the mountain pass alone in hopes of being rescued. She tried following electric cables, but they only led her to an abandoned village. Her mind had been shattered by what she had witnessed. Eventually, she made it back to civilization, but at first was too traumatized to tell anyone what had happened. Still, when she came back alone, a search and rescue operation was immediately launched for the other group members. Their bodies wouldn't be found for another month, by which point animals had already started devouring them. What the rescuers could tell was that the figures in the snow were contorted and their faces were twisted in pain. It was a scary picture, said one of the rescue team. The hikers were lying on a small ledge, some huddled together, some a little distance away. They had no eyes. In the empty sockets and parted mouths, worms were crawling. We packed the bodies in plastic bags. When they flew to Ulan-Ude, the smell in the helicopter was impossible. Some of the men were sick. To this day, we still don't know what strange phenomenon claimed the lives of 6 of those 7 hikers. Autopsies confirm that they were all otherwise healthy, though there was bruising in all of their lungs. Could this have all been the result of some strange sickness? Some sort of poisoning? Hypothermia perhaps? Or did they stumble into a secret test site for nerve agents? What's strange is that there were numerous other hiking groups in the same area, yet none of them were affected by whatever killed Valia's group. There's a lot of debate online about this, but as of right now, no definitive conclusion. Let's rewind the clock back to February 1st and take a trip to Yakima County, Washington. En Route 24 near Moxie, a man was spotted lying down, dead in the middle of the road. He was middle-aged, wearing glasses, and dressed in a military-style outfit with work boots. There were no substances in his system. He was believed to be the victim of a hidden run, and a Chevrolet Camaro was seen speeding away from the scene around the time he died. Since he wasn't carrying any form of ID on him, his identity remained a mystery. He would stay at John Doe for another 10 years. But that's not even the crazy part. Let's get into it. The day before the John Doe's body was discovered in Yakima County, 1,600 miles away in Amarillo, Texas, Karen Glenn Lewis and her daughter were returning home from a shopping weekend in Dallas. They opened the front door to their home, expecting to find their husband and father, David Glenn Lewis, waiting for them inside. But they didn't. The house was empty. Strange. Stranger still was that David's wedding ring and watch had been left on the kitchen counter. It was Super Bowl weekend, and a tape which had been manually set to record the match was still recording, despite the fact that the game was long over. There were 2 freshly made turkey sandwiches in the fridge. There was no note or anything to indicate where David might have gone. It seemed as if he had left suddenly and in a hurry, but why had he left his ring and watch behind in plain view? The following day, when David still hadn't returned home, on that same morning the John Doe's body was discovered, Karen filed a missing persons report for her husband. The investigators examined the house and found no signs of a struggle or forced entry. It appeared as if David had left on his own volition. That didn't make sense though. David was a devoted family man with a good job, and, as far as everyone knew, a stable state of mind. Their search for David quickly turned up a vital clue. His car was found in Amarillo's downtown area. Under the driver's mat were David's house and car keys. In the glove box were his credit cards and driving license. All of David's personal items were now accounted for. The only thing missing was the man himself. This is when Karen, his wife, told the detectives a vital piece of information. Just before he disappeared, David had confided in her that his life was in danger, but refused to go into details about it, only telling her that someone had been threatening him. This is where his job comes into play. David was an attorney, and even the most amicable of attorneys have enemies. Though we don't know exactly who was threatening David or why, it could easily have been one of his former clients who felt that David had failed them in some way. On top of that, David was a man with strong principles. His law firm were fighting their own case against a wealthy client, and David was scheduled to speak against his own company. He told his own father that at the deposition, he planned to tell the truth, whoever it hurt. With the law firm standing to lose a lot of money if David refused to lie, it's possible that they were involved in his disappearance somehow. After digging a little deeper, the investigators learned that David had booked a plane ticket on January 31st, the same day he vanished. This ticket was from Dallas to Amarillo. Wait a second. David's wife and daughter had just come from Dallas back to Amarillo on that same day. David wasn't in Dallas with them. That suggests that he had secretly followed his family to Dallas, although how he got there remains unknown, and then booked a plane ticket so he could get home before them, and make it appear as if he had been at home the entire time. It's unknown whether he made that flight or not. The plot thickened even further when they also learned that he had booked a ticket on February 1st, the day he was reported missing, the day that John Doe was found. This ticket was from Los Angeles International Airport to Dallas. This extremely strange and seemingly nonsensical twist in the investigation took the detectives down a rabbit hole, which led to a dead end. The only other thing they learned was that on February 1st, a man matching David's description got a taxi from a hotel in Dallas to Fort Worth International Airport. The taxi driver said that the man was extremely nervous and fumbled to pay him with a wad of $100 bills. With no other information to go off, the case went cold. 10 years would pass. Then, in 2003, a patrol detective named Pat Didder made a connection between David's case and that of the unknown John Doe in Washington. If you hadn't guessed already, the two men were one and the same. This was confirmed after a DNA test. David was the John Doe who died in a supposed hidden run 1,600 miles from his home. This was a huge discovery. The mystery surrounding the whereabouts of David Glenn Lewis had been solved. But even though that mystery now had an answer, we can't really classify David's case as being complete. There are still a whole bunch of unanswered questions pertaining to his death. Why was he in Washington in the first place? How did he get there? Why was he wearing a military uniform when he died? Why had he secretly booked these bizarre plane tickets? What business did he have in Los Angeles? Did he really book the tickets on his own accord, or was he taken against his will? Did any of this have to do with the threats made to David's life? Was the hidden run really an accident? No one has ever been able to answer any of these questions. Still, the police have discounted foul play, and the investigation into David's case has officially ceased. So, there we have it. The two mysteries of the Yakima County John Doe and the whereabouts of David Glenn Lewis turned out to be one big mystery after all. Still, the puzzle remains incomplete, the unanswered questions being the missing pieces. It's an intriguing case, one that continues to baffle professional investigators and internet sleuths alike, even all these years later. Hopefully one day we'll have some answers, and David's family can have the closure they so desperately crave. Burari, Central Delhi District. Back in 2018, this was home to the Chundawats, a respectable, middle-class family consisting of 11 members. With the head of the family, Bhopal, having passed, the matriarch and new head of the household was 77-year-old Narayan Devi. Living with her were her two sons, Bhavnesh and Lalit, their wives, Savita and Tina, daughter, Pratibha, and 5 grandchildren, Priyanka, Nita, Monu, Dhruv, and Shivam. The family made their money in plywood and groceries, and owned 2 stores in town. Their grocery shop, the centerpiece of the whole neighborhood, was on the first floor of their home. On the morning of July 1st, 2018, local shoppers were surprised to find the store still closed with the lights off. Strange. Bhavnesh, the eldest son, cherished the business like one of his children. Nobody could remember a time where he opened the store late. As the morning went by, nobody from the family had come downstairs to open the shop doors. Concerned, a friend of the family decided to go inside and check that everything was alright. Bizarrely, the door was still open. He entered, and what he found inside was like a scene from a horror movie. Hanging in a circular formation from the hallway ceiling were 10 bodies, swinging back and forth like tree branches in the wind. Their hands were bound behind their backs. Blindfolds covered their eyes. Tape covered their mouths. Cotton wool plugged their ears. Pieces of cloth masked all of their faces. 5 stools stood on the floor beneath them. The only other family member, 77-year-old Narayan, was found lying on the floor, all of the life squeezed out of her. The Chundawats were no more. Their family friend ran outside and sounded the alarm, and one of India's darkest and weirdest cases was officially under investigation. Detectives on the case were faced with several difficult questions. Who had done this to the family? The respectable Chundawats didn't have any known enemies. Why were 10 of them hanging so ritualistically, yet the family's matriarch wasn't? What was the significance of the taped mouths, wrapped eyes, covered faces, and blocked ears? An autopsy confirmed that all the family members' lives had ended without a struggle. There was nothing untoward in any of their systems. The first thing the authorities had to establish was whether the Chindawats had done this to themselves, or if they'd been slain by some unknown perp or perps. The fact that there were 5 stools in the room, and that nobody in the family had struggled, suggested the former, but it didn't make any sense that they would have all tied their hands behind their backs and covered their eyes, mouths, ears and faces. Not to mention, some of their feet were still touching the ground slightly. The blindfolds and face coverings had all been cut from a single bedsheet inside the house, so if this whole thing was the Chindawats' own doing, then it appeared to have been a very spur-of-the-moment decision with minimal planning. Several other bizarre clues came to light when the investigators examined the scene. Most notably, 8 cell phones belonging to the family were found taped inside a drawer, hidden from view. What did this all mean? The detectives soon learned that Lalit, the 45-year-old second son of Narayan, who was also found swinging in the hallway, had been acting very strangely in the days leading up to the incident. He'd been talking about how his deceased father was appearing to him in his dreams, and how his old man was trying to possess him. They pursued this lead and found 11 diaries and a number of notebooks belonging to Lalit that took this investigation in a completely unexpected direction. For the past 11 years, Lalit had been documenting his obsession with moksha, a set of rituals that were meant to bring about the salvation of his family's souls. You see, Lalit had a side hobby, the occult. And what's more, he'd somehow gotten his whole family interested in his strange practices. His notebooks and diaries detailed the strange rituals that they'd all been practicing, and how they believed these rituals were bringing them closer to summoning the spirit of their deceased patriarch, Narayan's husband, Bhopal. The most vital piece of evidence found in these notes, however, were instructions written by Lalit himself on how the family should tie their hands behind their backs, and how they should cover their faces in preparation for the so-called Kriya, the ritual that would finally allow them to meet their patriarch's spirit. It also stated that since Narayan couldn't stand, she would complete the ritual on the floor. Since their remains were found in the same way Lalit had specified in his notes, it quickly became clear that the family had done this to themselves. They had obviously been planning this for a long time, and had somehow managed to keep it a secret from everybody. Nobody in the neighborhood had any idea that the family were actually practicing dark magic. The most haunting part of all of this is that it appears that the Chindawats thought they'd actually survived the ritual. Lalit himself had written in his notes, "Everyone will tie their own hands, and when the Kriya is done, then everyone will help each other untie their hands." He'd even made notes about how they were going to perform the Kriya again a week later to bring fortune to another relative. Priyanka was engaged to be wed that next week as well, and the whole family had been excitedly preparing for the event. They all had future plans and aspirations. They clearly didn't expect things to end the way they did, though from an outsider's perspective, it's hard to see how they couldn't have. Lalit was clearly a delusional man, and investigators concluded that this was all a case of shared psychotic disorder, and that the family had decided to follow Lalit's instructions without question. Still, it's hard to imagine how one goes about convincing 10 family members to willingly go through with such a plan. Despite all of the evidence, there are of course still those who believe that someone else was responsible for what happened to the Chindawats. However, without any other evidence, suspects, or possible motive, I think it's safe to say that this case has officially been solved. The photo on screen is of Issei Sagawa, also known as Pang, a notorious celebrity in Japan. At only 4'9", he's small in stature, but not in personality. His notoriety was at its peak between 1986 and 1997, during which time he constantly appeared on Japanese television as a guest speaker and commentator. He appeared in horror movies and wrote best-selling cookery books. Cookery books. Yeah. Notice how in this photo he's eating a dish. Well, food was his claim to fame. But not just any food. Sagawa was a real-life cannibal. In 1981, while studying in Paris, France, he invited his classmate, Renée Harteveld, a 25-year-old Dutch woman, to translate poetry together for an upcoming assignment. She agreed. While reading a poem at a desk in his apartment, Sagawa walked up behind her and shot her in the back of the neck with a hunting rifle. He then had his way with her remains. His ultimate plan, though, was to eat her. Sagawa considered himself short, weak and ugly. Renee, on the other hand, was tall and beautiful, full of life. He believed that by consuming her, he could absorb her energy. He tried to bite into her flesh raw, but found it to be too difficult and unpalatable. So, he calmly walked to a local store, purchased a butcher's blade, and began slicing off parts of Renee's body to cook. He ate most of her face and chest, taking photos of her at each stage of his dining experience. When he was finally sated, he stored other parts of her in his refrigerator for later, placed the rest of her into 2 suitcases, and tried to dump them in a lake. Luckily, he was caught red-handed while trying to do so, and the officers found parts of Renee inside the 2 cases he was carrying. Luckily for Sagawa, and unluckily for the rest of us, his parents were extremely rich. His father hired a top lawyer for him, and he was able to escape jail time after being declared legally insane. He was held in a French hospital, but when a Japanese author published a story about him, people in the land of the rising sun became morbidly curious about his story. He gained a sort of macabre celebrity status, which no doubt contributed to the French authorities' decision to deport him back to Japan, where he was quickly determined to be sane after all. Now, with no charges against him, Sagawa checked himself out of hospital immediately, and remains a free man to this day, having served no time in prison whatsoever. The photo of Sagawa you're looking at now was featured on the cover of a well-known Japanese magazine, Spa. It featured an article in which he reviewed a restaurant. Considering what he was famous for, that's in bad taste. Sagawa also went on to write a best-selling book about his killing of Renee. Certainly not a book for the faint of heart, as it goes into explicit detail about what he did. It's strange and disappointing to realize that someone like Sagawa could not only escape justice, but also go on to become famous and profit from his despicable actions. Now, given the context, this image of him eating with a cocky, dead-eyed stare becomes something truly haunting. He got away with it all, and he loves it. You'll be happy to know that things have changed. Nowadays, Sagawa is detested by the younger generations and has fallen out of the limelight. He struggles to find employment. Issei Sagawa was born in Kobe, which is currently the city where I live. Yeah, internationally, I'm glad we're famous for our beef, and not for this guy. It's no secret that I'm a fan of grunge music. Nirvana's pretty much the reason I picked up a guitar when I was a teenager. I was lucky enough to see Chris Cornell perform live shortly before he died, and Lane Staley might just be my favourite rock vocalist of all time. But even though the so-called Seattle sound dominated the airways back in the early to mid-90s, not every band rose to stardom. One little-known group from that grunge era was the Gits. The frontwoman and driving force of the band was Mia Zapata, a young woman with an electric personality and stage presence. Though the Gits never achieved much mainstream success, their snappy punk tracks and Mia's fierce charisma earned them a passionate and loyal following. By 1993, when grunge was at its peak, the Gits were just starting to make a lot of noise in the industry. They were sharing bills with the likes of Sublime and Green Day. Sadly, in the early hours of July 7th, everything came to a screeching halt when Mia Zapata's body was found in the middle of an empty street. She'd been raped and strangled to death with the drawstrings of the Gits hoodie she was wearing. She'd been beaten so badly that even if she hadn't been strangled, she'd have perished from her internal injuries. Mia was just 27 years old. An investigation began. On the evening of July 6th, Mia had been out drinking with her friends in Seattle's Capitol Hill area. She left the bar she was at around 2 a.m. to go and look for her ex-boyfriend, but, unable to track him down, she instead went to another friend's apartment where she briefly hung out. Soon after, she walked off alone into the night. 80 minutes later, a woman spotted her lifeless body sprawled out on a deserted street, just 2 miles from the bar where she'd been with her friends. For the longest time, the police didn't have any leads to speak of. By 1998, after 5 years of investigation, Seattle police declared that they were no closer to solving the case than when they first started. There weren't any bodily fluids or fingerprints at the scene. The only DNA evidence they were able to collect didn't belong to anyone on their database. With the police struggling to solve the case, the surviving GITS members, who were desperate for justice, put on a bunch of local shows so that they could raise money to hire a private investigator. Nirvana even appeared as a special guest at one of the concerts to help draw attention to Mia's case, and they even featured on a fundraising album. The shows and album sales generated around $70,000, enough money to hire a PI for 3 years. Sadly, this led to no new suspects coming to light. Despite all the publicity, Mia's case faded into obscurity and went cold. Then, in 2002, almost a decade after Mia's life was so tragically cut short, there was a huge development. The DNA swab that had been taken from the scene 9 years prior finally came up with a match. A man from Florida named Jesus Mesquia, who'd just been arrested for unconnected reasons. They took his DNA, entered it into their database, and it came back positive. He had been living in Seattle at the time of the incident and had an extensive history. When they took him in for questioning, he was initially very calm, but when they asked if he had ever killed anyone in Seattle, he exploded. Yeah, this was their guy. They charged him with Mia's murder that very day. At his trial, the prosecutors asked him a question. How is it possible that his saliva was found on Mia's remains back in '93, when the two of them had never met before? Jesus refused to answer. It took the jury 3 days to find him guilty, and the judge sentenced him to 37 years behind bars. He later appealed, and his 37-year sentence was reduced to 36. Though we don't know the exact sequence of events that fateful night, it's theorized that Jesus saw Mia leave the bar alone, and then followed her to her friend's apartment. He waited for her to leave outside. She'd been wearing a headset that night, so likely didn't hear him coming up behind her. He then dragged Mia into his car. After her death, the remaining GITS members formed the charity organization Home Alive with the purpose of teaching women self-defense skills, not wanting what happened to Mia to happen to anyone else. Grunge itself died out not long after her untimely demise with the death of Kurt Cobain, but Mia's legacy still endures in the hearts and minds of many rock fans, especially those in Seattle. This is Sarah Funk, a travel vlogger who visited Cyprus's Mistero Red Lake back in 2017. The lake itself is infamous for its sanguine water, which, in many travellers' minds, gives the place an eerie quality. No wonder there's a bunch of ghost stories and urban legends linked to the place. In actuality, the lake is red because of chemicals used by a British mining company while extracting gold deposits, making the water highly toxic with a pH level of less than 2. That's akin to battery acid. In a video she uploaded to YouTube about the lake, Sarah and her partner can be heard joking about how creepy the lake is, and the strange, unsettling atmosphere about the area in general. "This is what murder episodes are made of," joked Sarah's partner. In that same video, you can make out a suitcase poking out of the water. Neither Sarah nor her viewers paid it much attention, or had any inclination about what might be hidden inside. Fast forward to 2 years after the video was uploaded. Nikos Metaxas, an ex-military officer, was arrested in Cyprus and confessed to slaying 5 women and 2 youngsters over a 3-year period. All of the adults were domestic workers from overseas. He likely targeted them because he knew that the Cypriot officials would be less inclined to pursue cases involving housekeepers from other, poorer countries. A sad reality, and the authorities in the country have since come under fire for this. When questioned what he did with his victims' remains, Metaxas answered, "I placed their bodies into suitcases and dumped 3 of them into the Mistero Red Lake." Since then, 4 of the 7 victims have been found, 2 of them in the Red Lake. Though never officially confirmed, it does seem likely that the suitcase in Sarah's video contained one of those bodies. She's since removed the video from her YouTube channel, stating that she wants the focus to be on the victims and not her day trip out to the lake. Nikos Metaxas himself received 7 life sentences. Okay, so quick warning. Don't Google this case unless you're okay with seeing some really, really messed up photos. I mean seriously, if you're squeamish, don't do it. I won't be showing them here, obviously, but if you decide to do your own research, don't come back here blaming Papa Lazy. Disclaimer over, let's get into it. So it's kind of difficult to cover solved and unsolved crimes from certain countries due to language barriers and reporting biases. For instance, over the course of my life, I've lived in Hong Kong, Taiwan and Japan, travelled around most of Asia, and watched the news and made friends with the locals. There are some really interesting, and honestly messed up cases from all of those countries that we just never hear about in the West. That's because they're not reported. Since all the media surrounding them are in their native languages, even if you had heard about one, without a bilingual translator, you'll never be able to get an accurate picture of what happened, and only ever have a surface-level understanding of the events. As such, the vast majority of these mysteries remain region-locked, so to speak. Well, here's one from China that slipped through the net. And let me tell you, this is one messy rabbit hole to delve into. Nanda, aka the Nanjing University dismemberment case, is one of the most infamous and disturbing cold cases in Chinese history. Though the story surrounding it has gained urban legend status in the country over the years, the events that took place are all too real. The year was 1996. Nanjing University was, and still is, considered one of the best schools in all of the People's Republic, with a student body made up of the nation's best and brightest. A place where everything is orderly. On the morning of January 19th, however, the campus would wake up to a very unexpected, very unwelcome surprise. An employee cleaning the school's roads came across a bag of mystery meat in a disposable food waste bag in a dumpster. There were about 500 cooked pieces of meat inside. Being poor, and assuming that the meat had just been thrown out by the cafeteria staff, she took it home with her to eat. When she got home, she started washing the meat. She had found it in a dumpster after all. It's then that she noticed something at the bottom of the bag. 3 severed human fingers. This wasn't a bag of meat at all. It was a bag of human remains. And what's more, this wasn't the only bag found. The police were already investigating other reports from people who had made the same grisly discovery. Scattered around the university campus were 8 more bags, each filled with human remains which had been diced up and cooked. In a bedsheet near the main gate, investigators found the head of a human female. In another by a canal, they found some of her torso. Nearby were the girl's neatly folded clothes. Only her underwear was missing. Aside from being stained red with blood, they were in perfect condition, not torn up or anything. It was determined that all of her body parts had been dumped in the early hours of the morning that they were found. Nobody had noticed the burp. Altogether, the authorities found more than 2,000 separate pieces of whoever this woman was. Yeah, 2,000 pieces. The coroners did their best to piece her back together so that they could get a better idea of who the victim might be. In doing so, they realized that 4 of her organs were missing. Her heart, liver, spleen, and a section of her intestines. The rest of her remains had been boiled, even the head. Whoever had sliced her up had done so with surgical precision and had used multiple tools to get the job done. The detectives clearly weren't dealing with a run-of-the-mill psycho with this one. They reached out to the parents of all of the students who hadn't been seen on the school grounds for the past few days. The mother of the victim was able to identify her daughter thanks to a distinguishing mole on her boiled face. These were the remains of Diao Aiqing, a 19-year-old freshman at the university. She was shy, solitary, and academically gifted. She didn't have any friends on campus, but then again, she didn't have any enemies either. She'd been missing for the past 9 days, but because she was always so quiet, nobody had noticed her absence. It's not clear at what point during those 9 days her life was taken. Some of her classmates reported seeing her on a busy market street on the night she disappeared. News of the case got out, and it quickly became a huge headline. The detectives knew they had to catch the perp. They took blood samples from all of the students who knew or had classes with Yao, from anyone with a history in the nearby area, from everyone in her hometown. more than 10,000 people were questioned. The market where Diao was last seen was searched thoroughly. This all resulted in diddly squat. Nothing. The case went cold. So, what happened to Diao? Who was responsible for literally butchering her, and why did they do it? Well, like I said, because of its morbidity, this case is quite infamous in China, and when the internet became widespread in the bigger cities, a lot of theories started popping up online. Some interesting, some just downright bizarre. Reddit user Louthan Clarkson recently detailed some of the more popular ones, and I highly recommend checking out their post, link in the bio, but I'll briefly go over some of those theories here. Theory 1. Jiao was captured and killed by the university itself. The med department there was preparing for China's first intestinal transplant, and they chose Jiao as an unwilling donor. Theory 2. Jiao went to the market stalls that fateful night to purchase heavy metal CDs, only to be ritualistically slain by the stall's owner so that he could absorb her soul. Theory 3. Jiao was simply killed by one cannibalistic serial killer or another. There were several that operated in the area at the time. Theory 4. Jiao was slain for her 4 missing organs, which were then sold on the black market. Theory 5. Somebody killed Jiao using the method of 1,000 cuts, so that, according to Confucianism, her soul would never be complete in the afterlife. This may have been a roommate who had an argument with Jiao shortly before she died. So yeah, like I said, some plausible theories, some crazy ones. But those are all just theories. After more than 2 decades, you're probably thinking that this case must at least have a main suspect, right? Well, according to one local news source, Jiao's case was actually solved. Apparently the perpetrator was a man named Li Jishuo. Jishuo was a well-respected medical professor at the university, was considered to be one of the top scientific professionals in all of China, and was the son of a high-up government official. The article, written in Mandarin, even states that he confessed to taking Jiao's life and slicing her up, but that he was subsequently released due to insufficient material evidence. The report ends by saying that he and his wife fled to the US immediately after he was released. If that report's to be believed, then this case has indeed been solved, but since that's the only article online about this case actually having a resolution, well, it's kind of hard whether to say it's true or not. Given how corrupt the Chinese system is, I have to say it's pretty believable, and Jishuo certainly would have had the medical skill to slice her up so methodically. Still, with no other sources to back up the article's claim, and no supporting evidence, interviews, or details to speak of, we're kind of left in a bizarre limbo at the bottom of this rabbit hole. This case was solved. Or was it? If you Google Jiao's name in Chinese, the next suggested search result that comes up is Li Jishuo. Searching his name leads to various discussion boards and conspiracy websites, some claiming that he killed Jiao as part of a medical experiment because of her rare Rh blood type, others saying that the pair were former lovers. Again, all of those online rumours are just that, rumours. There's little in the way of real evidence to substantiate any of those posts. So, it could be that Li Jishuo was responsible for Jiao's death, or he could just be a scapegoat in a case that still doesn't have an answer. People do like to speculate and reach conclusions after all. It's hard to find information about this case written in English, but it's been discussed a lot on the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, so if you're interested in reading more, or sharing your own theories about what happened, I'd recommend heading over there and checking out some of the posts. I've left links in the description below. Regular viewers of this channel might remember a video I made a while back. 5 video clips with disturbing backstories. In it, I talked about the dating game killer, Rodney Alcala, a man who appeared on a TV dating show back in the 70s, who later turned out to be a serial murderer. I know lots of you might have missed that episode, seeing how it got hit by the yellow button of demonetization, so for those of you who didn't tune in, the short story is that between 1968 and 1979, Alcala claimed the lives of at least 8 people across various states in the US, though his exact number of victims remains unclear, and could be as many as 130. Alcala's methods were simple but effective. He'd pretend to be a professional photographer and offer his potential victims the opportunity for a private, high-quality photo shoot. Lured in by his good looks and charm, many people, mostly women, accepted his proposal. Once he'd gained their trust by taking a few snaps of them in public, he'd invite them to join him in a more private setting. When he had them alone and to himself, that's when Alcala would not only take their final pictures, but their lives as well. When he was finally apprehended, investigators found Alcala's camera, along with multiple photo albums. There were thousands of pictures of hundreds of different people, all of them potential victims. As such, it remains unknown just how many lives Alcala claimed during his 11-year rampage. Over the years, the authorities have been able to track down some of the individuals from the photos, but many of them remain unaccounted for. Despite there being a public request for people from the photos to come forward, the identities and well-being of many of the photographed people remain unknown to this day. Despite their innocent appearance, any of these photos could be of people he slayed moments later. Do you recognize anyone in these images? If so, you might hold the answer to a small part of a very large, very sinister mystery. There's something particularly sickening about evil doctors and nurses who purposefully take the lives of their patients. Perhaps it's because they've sworn an oath to do the exact opposite of that, or because they're in a position of power over such vulnerable people, or because their medical knowledge helps them cover their tracks more easily. Anyway, no prizes for guessing what this next entry's about. A few days ago, I was surfing through Reddit as one does, when I came across an AMA titled, "I Hunt Medical Serial Killers. Ask Me Anything." Well, that caught my attention. The whole thread was hosted by a guy who worked on exposing doctors and nurses that use their medical expertise to prematurely end the lives of their patients, mostly just for the thrill of it. He even shared the disturbing insight that, although in a lot of these cases the other staff members know their co-worker is killing their patients, they frequently still remain working without any action taken against them until the media or law enforcement gets involved. And that's disappointing to hear. But perhaps most of them just don't want to believe that one of their own could really be doing something so terrible, and convince themselves that they're just imagining things. I'm trying to look on the positive side here, guys. Anyway, one user asked the question, in your opinion, what are some of the most crazy stories of medical serial killers? They're similar in some respects, and unique in others, replied the OP. I think the nurse in Italy who took a selfie with her and the patient she had just murdered is pretty crazy. The nurse he was talking about is Daniela Poggiali. At her hospital in Lugo, northern Italy, medical staff started to become concerned with their rising mortality rate. A lot of patients, particularly the older ones, were dying at an alarming rate. This perplexed most of them, who wanted to get to the bottom of this mystery. After a while, some of the other nurses started becoming suspicious of Daniela. They began to notice that she would sedate patients that would bother her during her shifts. This behaviour started to raise a few eyebrows, and people secretly started paying more attention to what Daniela was getting up to on her rounds. The more keen-eyed amongst them realised that whenever Daniela was on duty, the death rate at the hospital went up, and whenever she'd go on vacation, it would drop back down again. A coincidence? Maybe, but definitely an observation that warranted closer inspection. In the end, it turned out that Daniela was indeed poisoning her patients with potassium chloride. A woman named Manuela Alki recalled how when her mother was sick at the hospital with a mild ailment, Daniela rushed her out of the room, saying that she had things to do. 10 minutes later, Manuela returned to find a small glass vial attached to her mother's drip feed, which hadn't been there before. This vial ran out in just a few minutes. After that, her mother started convulsing, and her eyes rolled back into her head. A few minutes after that, she was gone. Traces of potassium chloride leave the body very quickly, and it's extremely hard to detect. Luckily, one of her more suspicious co-workers quickly ran some tests on the dead woman, and found traces of the poison just in time. A used vial of potassium chloride was also found in a disposal unit. This was reported, and the authorities soon paid a visit to Daniela. They asked if she could explain to them one thing. Why was she present for 93 deaths in 2 years at the hospital, more than 3 or 4 times the average of her other colleagues, and more than double that of the nurse with the second highest figure? Just bad luck, she said. Daniela was quickly arrested. During their investigation, a lot of disturbing details emerged surrounding Daniela. How she stole her patients' personal belongings, gave them extra laxatives to cause trouble for the next person on shift, administered sleeping agents to ensure an easy shift for herself. They even learned that when one of her co-workers said they were going to report her for her behaviour, Daniela subtly threatened them by leaving a funeral bouquet on the hood of their car. When they searched her phone, they found these 2 images of her, smiling and laughing next to the bodies of 2 patients whose lives she had just ended. She appeared in court, laughing and smiling just like in those photos, and didn't appear to be taking the whole thing very seriously. While in prison, the blonde nurse received a slew of fan mail from admirers, and even got the odd marriage proposal or 2. In a twisted way, she seemed to be enjoying the publicity she was receiving. In 2016, she was sentenced to life behind bars. Despite the authorities being sure of her guilt, and this case effectively being solved, Daniela made an appeal the following year, and was released in 2017 over a technicality. She still faces criminal action over the other deaths she's suspected of. Greeley, Colorado, December 20th, 1984. Janelle Matthews, age 12, was performing with the Franklin Middle School Choir at a Christmas concert. Her adoptive family weren't in attendance, since her mum was away visiting Janelle's sick grandfather, and her dad was watching his other daughter's basketball game elsewhere. After the concert, Janelle called a ride home with her friend and friend's mother. They dropped her off at her house at around 8:15 p.m. Janelle entered her family home and found herself completely alone. Her father and sister still hadn't returned. At 8:30, the telephone rang, and Janelle took a message for her father. That was the last time anyone heard of her. An hour later, at 9:30, Janelle's father returned home. The youngster was nowhere to be found. By 10, there was still no sign of her, and he really started to worry. He phoned the police to report his daughter missing. Investigators arrived at the house 15 minutes later and noticed something extremely chilling. There were footprints in the snow outside leading up to the house. Someone had been looking in through the downstairs windows. There were no signs of a struggle or forced entry, but it was clear that someone had taken Janelle. The hunt for her was on. Janelle's disappearance received a lot of public attention at the time, and President Ronald Reagan even mentioned her during a speech. News publications across the country frequently reported on her case. Unfortunately, this was all for naught. For 35 years, Janelle's whereabouts and well-being remained unknown. During all that time, there were barely any leads to work with. It was as if she had just vanished in a puff of smoke. Then, by sheer coincidence, on July 23rd, 2019, workers installing pipeline about 15 miles from where Janelle used to live made a disturbing discovery. In the earth, they found human bones. A DNA test confirmed that the remains belonged to Janelle. Further examination proved that her life had been ended by a gunshot to the head. As tragic as this was, after 35 years she'd finally been found, and her family could have a small modicum of closure. But the question still remained. Who had so coldly taken her life away that snowy December night in '84? Well, with her body now discovered, the wheels on this case were finally in motion, and less than 2 months later, authorities announced they had a person of interest. That person was Steve Pankey, a man who'd run for governor in Idaho in 2014 and 2018. He even made his own YouTube account to support his campaign for governorship, an account which has the grand total of 8 subscribers. Pankey had been a youth pastor at the church Janelle's family went to, and lived just 2 miles away from them. In October of this year, they had enough evidence to indict him for Janelle's murder. Numerous details came out following this indictment. It was revealed that Pankey had long been a suspect in the case because he couldn't help inserting himself into it. He'd often go to the police and tell them that he had information about the case, and that in exchange for immunity, he could tell them about it. This of course piqued their suspicion. In 2008, Pankey's own son was murdered, and at the funeral, Pankey was heard bizarrely muttering to himself, "I hope God didn't allow this to happen because of Janelle Matthews." Panky was also a Patreon supporter of numerous podcasts that covered Janelle's mysterious disappearance, including The Trail Went Cold. The guy was obsessed with his involvement right up until the day he was caught. Only then did he start playing dumb and saying that he'd never heard of Janelle or her family. Detectives questioned Panky's wife about everything, and the poor woman had no idea that she'd been living with Janelle's killer for all of those years. She recalled how at the time of her disappearance, her husband had taken an uncharacteristic interest in the case, frequently scouring radio stations for news about the missing girl. He even forced his wife to read newspaper articles about Janelle's case. She also told them that a short while after news of the case broke out, her husband's car mysteriously caught fire and had to be disposed of at a salvage yard. She has since divorced her killer husband. Sorry, former husband. So, there we have it. After 33 years, Steve Panky no doubt thought he got away with murder. Well, he thought wrong. These are the kind of photos that turn your stomach. Yadira Reyes was 26 years old when she went on a date with Michael Gargiulo, pictured here. He seemed like a nice guy at first, of course, but as their date progressed, he started to become forceful, aggressive. You can see just how comfortable Yadira was in these images. The date ended even worse, with Michael ushering Yadira into the back of his van, driving her to a secluded area, and then beginning to have his way with her against her will. She protested through the entire ordeal, until Michael finally gave in and got off her. He agreed to drive Yadira back to her home, but warned her to keep her mouth shut. Now that backstory is horrible enough, but an entire decade later, Yadira would receive a phone call that put the whole encounter into an even darker context. You see, you might know Michael Gargiulo by another alias, namely, the Hollywood Ripper. Not that Yadira or anyone else at the time knew that, of course. He was responsible for the murder of at least 3 women when he and Yadira went on their date together, though his true number of victims could be as many as 10. It's unknown whether Gargiulo was responsible for stabbing his 18-year-old neighbor to death on her back doorstep when he was 17, though he allegedly moved from Glenview, Illinois to Los Angeles to escape the heat from the authorities. Several other incidents have been positively linked to him, though. In 2001, he stabbed Ashley Ellerin 47 times at her Hollywood home, inflicting a neck wound so deep that her head almost became detached from her body. On the night of her death, she had planned to go for dinner and drinks with her then romantic interest, Ashton Kutcher. The actor would later go on to testify at Gargiulo's trial, stating that he went to Ashley's home mere moments after she'd been murdered. He saw what he thought was red wine on her carpet. In 2005, Gargiulo again took a blade and repeatedly stabbed his neighbor to death in El Monte, California. In 2008, he again attempted to slash a different neighbor to death in Santa Monica. Definitely not a guy you want to live next to, I can tell you that much. Luckily, the woman he attacked was able to fend Gargiulo off, and investigators were able to match DNA found at the scene to Gargiulo. He was apprehended 1 month later. After numerous delays, Gargiulo's trial ended in 2019, where he was found guilty on all counts. His sentencing has also been delayed, so it's unknown whether he'll be spending the rest of his life in prison, or if he'll receive capital punishment. Only time will tell. Let's be honest, we've all got a few skeletons in our closet. Some of us, literally. This little mystery is absolutely bizarre and has a bunch of unanswered questions attached to it. Let's take a look at the body in the drag queen's closet. Dorian Corey was a relatively well-known trans woman, drag queen, and fashion designer living in Harlem. She'd regularly appeared in high-profile shows in the city, and even featured in the documentary Paris is Burning. Unfortunately for her, she never had much money to speak of. In 1993, Dorian passed away at the age of 56. It's not the circumstances of her death that are suspicious, though. 2 months after she passed, Dorian's friend and caretaker, Lois Taylor, and 2 of her pals were going through Dorian's closet in search of Halloween costumes. Dorian had given them permission to do so before she died. What they found inside was unexpected, to say the least. After rifling through feathers, fabrics and sequins, they noticed a large, green-plaid garment bag on the floor that was far too heavy for any of them to lift. Unable to find the zipper, Lois cut it open with a pair of scissors, hoping to find some exciting Halloween props to use inside. Instead, she and her friends found something else. The partially mummified corpse of a man curled up in the fetal position with a bullet hole in his head. A putrid stench escaped the bag and filled the room, and Lois immediately called the authorities. An investigation was quickly underway. The body itself had been wrapped in fake leather and plastic bags. After unwrapping it, several pull tabs from old 1960s flip-top beer cans fell out. The victim's once brown skin had turned yellow and purple. Their ears were reduced to mere cartilage, and they had obviously been dead for a long time. So, naturally, the detectives on the case were faced with several questions. Whose body was this? How long had they been deceased? How did they end up in Dorian's closet? Was she keeping it there? If so, why? Using a chemical solution to harden the body's brittle fingers, the coroners were able to retrieve a set of fingerprints. They now knew who the mouldy remains belonged to. The cadaver was Robert Bobby Worley, a former criminal with an extensive record. He hadn't been seen or heard from since the mid to late 60s. That, along with the pull tabs, led them to conclude that Bobby had been dead for the past 20 years. Still, that didn't explain why he was in Dorian's house. Had he been inside her closet for the whole 20 years? Was the drag queen actually a murderer? That didn't seem likely. Dorian was a calm, thoughtful and peaceful person. So, let's dive into this diva's rabbit hole and explore a few of the leading theories on the hows and whys. Theory number 1. Dorian and Bobby had a turbulent relationship that took a dark turn. Though Bobby was a very secretive person, he did allegedly open up to his brother about being in a relationship with a woman named Dorian, who he often fought with, sometimes physically. Bobby was a very aggressive person, so if the pair really were in a relationship, perhaps Dorian killed him in order to protect herself, or maybe even to get revenge. Theory number 2. This has never been confirmed by authorities, but supposedly a note was found pinned to Bobby's remains that simply read, "This poor man broke into my home and was trying to rob me." It was written in Dorian's handwriting. Like I said, Bobby had an extensive record. Perhaps he had broken into Dorian's home and she acted in self-defense. Finally, theory number 3. Dorian was covering up for the real murderer, hiding Bobby's body in her apartment to protect whoever had taken his life. Dorian had moved apartments in 1988, and it seems unlikely that she would have lugged a dead body to her new home. It's more likely that the body was already there in the apartment when she moved in. She may have moved to that new place specifically to help protect the previous occupant and safeguard their secret. Thing is, all of those theories fail to explain one important thing. Why didn't she get rid of the remains over the course of 20 years? Panic. According to Detective Figueroa, who worked the case, people just wrap up a body in whatever's available. It's just spontaneous. You wrap it up, then you put it in a suitcase, then you put it in the closet, then you just look at it periodically and wish that it would go away. On top of that, she lived in a bustling part of New York City, not exactly the easiest place to dispose of a body. After killing him, Dorian likely routinely covered Bobby in baking soda to suppress any odors. But then again, if she was innocent of any wrongdoing, why didn't she just come clean to the cops after killing him? Well, Dorian was a black trans woman living in a poor neighborhood. Given this incident had likely happened in the 60s, she probably feared that nobody would have any sympathy for her, even if she had acted in self-defense. Ultimately, we don't know which of these theories is correct. And because this isn't exactly a well-known case, no matter how far we dig into this rabbit hole, we'll probably never get a definitive answer. Back to Asia for this last one. A little-known mystery that caught my attention. It really resonates with me because it happened in a city I used to call home. Hong Kong. Annie Ashekian was a bright soul. A paralegal with a free spirit, she loved nothing more than travelling the globe and getting into adventures. By the time she turned 30, she'd already explored around 30 countries, mostly solo. When she turned 31 back in 2008, Annie was ready to jet off on a new expedition, this time with 2 of her friends. She'd just returned home to Canada after holidaying with her boyfriend. That's when her pals told her about a trip to China they had planned. She made a spur-of-the-moment decision to join them. Her family found that a little out of character. Sure, Annie loved to travel, but she was more of the planning type of gal. The type who spent weeks deciding where she wanted to go, what her itinerary would be, researching which restaurants to eat at. Nevertheless, 2 days after arriving back home, she flew from Toronto to Beijing with her 2 companions, with the intention of exploring as much of China as possible. She was slated to return home via India in December. But something happened to Annie during that spontaneous trip. Something nefarious. And for reasons that still remain unclear, she disappeared entirely. And today, 12 years later, her whereabouts and well-being remain unknown. Let's go over the details. Annie and her friends landed in Beijing on October 25th. Their first week there went according to plan, with the 3 of them exploring the city and the surrounding areas. On Friday, October 31st, that all changed. At 12:30 AM, in the early hours of Halloween, Annie upped and left the hotel she was staying at with her travel companions. The 2 other girls didn't think this was unusual. Annie liked to go off by herself and explore at her own pace, and they just assumed she was still jet-lagged and couldn't sleep, but she wanted to do something more interesting than lie around in bed restlessly. Later that morning, Annie returned to the hotel room. Here's where things get strange. After returning, she took a bath, had a coffee, and, strangely, packed up all of her things and checked out of the hotel alone without telling either of her friends what she was doing, where she was going, or why she was leaving. That was the last time either of them saw Annie. Like I said, the young globetrotter liked to travel solo, but it didn't make sense that she'd just pack up and leave without so much as a goodbye or an explanation. This troubled her friends, who both tried to contact her. Annie never replied to their calls or messages. Here's what we know. Sometime between October 31st and November 8th, Annie travelled to Xi'an by train, a journey that takes roughly 5 hours. Xi'an is one of China's most popular tourist destinations, so no major cause for concern just yet. On Wednesday, November 5th, Annie sent a final email from her Hotmail account. After this, she never sends another email again. On November 9th, Annie caught a plane from Xi'an and arrived in Hong Kong. The following day, there was an unconfirmed sighting of her at a place called Chungking Mansions. Now, I've been to Chungking Mansions myself. Over the years, it's cleaned up a little bit, but back then, it was known as the ghetto of Hong Kong. When I went, I was literally swarmed by aggressive people when I walked inside, all of them trying to sell me all sorts of stolen or illegal goods. Hong Kong was a really safe place when I was living there, but that was one of the few places everyone knew shady stuff was going down at. I can only imagine things were even worse back in 2008. Now, this sighting was unconfirmed, but if Annie really was there, was she visiting the mansions as a tourist? Staying in one of the really cheap hostels there? Or was her visit there for some other reason? On November 11th, Annie was caught on CCTV at Causeway Bay, withdrawing 2,800 Hong Kong dollars from an ATM. That's around $350 US. She appeared calm on the tape. At 8:30 AM that day, she sent her sister a text message saying to wish her niece a happy birthday. That was the last communication she had with any of her loved ones. On December 15th, Annie was scheduled to catch a plane from India back to Canada. She never made that flight. In fact, the records show that she never made it out of Hong Kong at all, not through an airport at least. Around Christmas, there was another unconfirmed sighting of Annie in Hong Kong's Wan Chai area. Wan Chai is a very seedy part of Hong Kong, the kind of place where they sell love by the hour. Despite its low crime rate, Hong Kong was, and still is, infamous for being a transit point for human trafficking. It's possible that her supposed sighting in Wanchai could mean she herself was a victim of trafficking, but that doesn't explain her strange behaviour leading up to her ultimate disappearance. It doesn't seem like she was forced to abandon her friends, then travel to Xi'an and then to Hong Kong, and it doesn't seem as if she was stressed at all in the video footage captured of her. Still, that unconfirmed sighting is the last piece of possible evidence we have, and where the trail for this particular case goes cold. What happened to Annie? Was she sold into servitude, or did she disappear on her own accord? Why did she so uncharacteristically leave her friends in Beijing without so much as a goodbye? Annie had a great career back in Canada, a happy relationship with her boyfriend, and the pair of them had bright future plans to move to Argentina together. It's so sad that that all went to waste. As of today, none of Annie's belongings have ever been recovered, and the authorities are no closer now to finding her than they were back then. He was born by the river in a little tent, and just like that river, he'd been running ever since. Sam Cooke was at the peak of his career in the late 50s, early 60s, but I'm sure even the youngsters among you are at least familiar with his biggest hits. For example, A Change Is Gonna Come, a song that's been covered countless times. What you might not be familiar with, though, is the uncertainty surrounding his death at the age of 33, when he was shot and killed in a California motel, apparently in self-defense. Or was he? The mystery surrounding this case isn't who pulled the trigger, but more to do with the circumstances of his killing, the reason behind it, and if it really happened the way the official report alleges. Let's start from the beginning. Known as the King of Soul, and credited by many as the pioneer of soul music, Sam Cooke's work contributed to the rise of other superstars like Aretha Franklin, Stevie Wonder, and Marvin Gaye. His career came to a literal dead end on the night of December 11th, 1964, when police were summoned to the Hacienda Motel in LA. They were responding to two separate reports of a kidnapping and a shooting. When they arrived, they found Sam Cooke on the floor with a hole in his chest. He'd been shot through the heart by the motel's manager, Bertha Franklin. She claimed to have killed him in self-defense, but Cooke's acquaintances quickly disputed this. This case is very much a he said, she said mystery, but with a few interesting clues mixed in, which might lead us to the correct answer. Here's the motel manager's version of events. According to Bertha Franklin, Cooke came banging on her office door in the middle of the night, shouting, "Where's the girl?" Bertha shouted back that she was alone in the office, and that whoever he was looking for, she wasn't in there with her. In a rage, Cooke then burst into the office, wearing nothing except for one shoe and a sport jacket. He then began to grapple with Bertha. She was able to break away from him, and ran to retrieve her firearm from the top of the TV she was watching. She fired 3 rounds, missing twice. One of the slugs hit its target though, Cooke's chest. He exclaimed, "Lady, you shot me," more astonished than angry. He then charged at her one final time, at which point she hit him over the head with a broom. He finally collapsed to the floor and died from his chest wound. Well, that's the story that Bertha told the investigators. So, who was this mystery woman that Cooke was looking for, and why was he so angry and adamant to find her? Well, Cooke had apparently arrived at the motel that evening, accompanied by a 22-year-old woman named Ellisa Boya. According to Ellisa, she and Cooke met at a nightclub that evening, and Cooke had agreed to drive her home. Instead of doing so, she said he instead drove her to the Hacienda Motel and began to forcefully undress her in the room he had just paid for. Fearing for her safety, she scooped up her own clothes, and accidentally scooped up Cooke's as well, and ran outside. She then made her way to a payphone and reported what had just happened to her. So, sounds pretty cut and dry, right? Sam Cooke was extremely talented and famous, but he also had a dark side, and got what he deserved in the end after trying to have his way with an unconsenting woman. Well, maybe. But Elisa's story has been called into question by many people, as her version of events don't seem to line up with reality. Her account contains numerous inconsistencies. For example, she claims to have met Sam at the club, but was seen with him at a place called Martoni's Restaurant much earlier in the evening. Everyone had their eyes on Cooke at the restaurant. He was, after all, a dashing celebrity. According to eyewitnesses, he was seen waving around thousands of dollars and buying all of his friends drinks. Those who were eavesdropping into his conversation said that Ellisa willingly went to the motel with him. When they arrived at the motel, Cook left Ellisa in the car while he went to book the room, which would have given her plenty of time to escape if she felt like she was in danger or had been forced to go there against her will. Not to mention, Ellisa herself was somewhat of a sordid character, and was the kind of girl who didn't mind selling her time and her body, if you get my meaning. In fact, she was arrested for doing so only 1 month after Cook's demise, busted by an undercover officer. Given her history, and the fact that Cook was known to carry large amounts of cash on him, it's been theorized that he hired her services, and that when they reached the motel, she actually slipped out with Cook's clothing intentionally to stop him from chasing her, and to take all of the money inside his pockets. Perhaps Cook's fury wasn't because a victim had escaped his clutches, but because he'd just been robbed. His anger was likely exacerbated by all of the drinks he had had at dinner. Still, if he really was grappling with Bertha, the manager, and if she really did fear for her own life, then that all doesn't matter, right? She was still justified in shooting him. The plot thickens again. Cook's friends examined his body at the morgue and found that it was in far worse shape than Bertha's story would have suggested. According to Bertha, an ex-madam with a criminal history of her own by the way, she simply shot Cook and then hit him on the head with a broomstick. However, when legendary singer Etta James viewed her friend's remains, she was shocked to find Cook's head almost detached from his torso, his hands broken and crushed, and his nose mangled. These injuries were far beyond the official account. In her mind, and in the minds of many of his friends, family and supporters, Cook wasn't slain by the manager alone, and certainly not in the way that her story presented. Some have even speculated that Cook was intentionally murdered by his manager, Alan Klein, who owned all of the rights to Cook's recordings. As an interesting side note, Ellisa Boyer, the woman Cook took to the motel that fateful night, was later charged with the murder of her own boyfriend, adding fuel to the conspiracy fire that Cook was indeed the victim of some sort of plan to take him out. In spite of that, no concrete evidence supporting a criminal conspiracy has been presented to date, and Cook's demise remains listed as a case of self-defense. So, that's the surprising mystery surrounding the death of the King of Soul. Did it really happen the way the official report claims, or is there more to this story than people are admitting to? Because of Sam Cooke's legendary status, this mystery will likely continue to captivate music fans for generations to come. Take a look at this seemingly normal photograph. Just looks like a picture of your typical dorky uncle alongside his daughter, right? Well, the man in this photo is actually Dennis Rader, better known as the BTK Killer. Over the span of 17 years, he took the lives of 10 people in the Wichita, Kansas metro area, including an entire family. He used everything from ropes and plastic bags to belts and pantyhose to strangle his victims. What made his actions even more harrowing, however, was that he liked to tie up the remains of those that he had slayed and photograph them in strange, contorted positions. He did so because it gave him satisfaction. That was his motivation. This photo, taken during his daughter's graduation, was captured less than 2 years before his arrest. Now, Dennis Rader was obviously a deplorable human being, and even in his day-to-day life, he did some pretty despicable things. He became a dog catcher in Park City. People noted how he took special joy in bullying single women. One neighbor even complained that he had killed her dog for absolutely no reason whatsoever. Still, for the most part, he managed to fit in well enough to avoid being detected by the authorities for 17 long years. He'd send investigators letters, taunting them for their inability to find him, along with little dolls with tied-up hands and feet, symbolizing those he had taken the lives of. But for all his boldness, Rader had one major weakness. He was completely tech-illiterate. So, one day, he sent one of his infamous letters to the cops, asking if they'd be able to trace him if he sent them a floppy disk. They, of course, said they wouldn't be able to, and, unbelievably, he actually sent them one. The authorities couldn't believe their luck. On the floppy disk, investigators found some metadata on a deleted document. It said, "Last modified by Dennis." From this, they were able to narrow down the suspects until it was obvious who the perp was. But that's where this photo comes into play. Despite being able to link the floppy disk to Dennis Rader, this still wasn't considered enough to bring him in. They needed a DNA sample. His daughter, pictured in this photo, had just graduated from Kansas State University's medical center. While there, she had to have a pap smear done. The authorities got a court order to take the smear and test the DNA. From that, they established a familial link to the DNA found at the crime scenes. And that's what brought Dennis Rader down. Rader was very upset that the police had lied to him about the disc being safe to send. "I need to ask you," he said to the lead detective on the case, "how come you lied to me?" The detective simply answered, "Because I was trying to catch you." When his house was searched after his capture, the cops came across a treasure trove of pictorial evidence. Some were of BTK's victims, but others were of himself, masked and dressed up in women's clothes. He had taken these pictures to reenact his crimes. These images helped to give us an insight into his mind at the time he was active. Unsettling stuff, to say the least. There's nothing like a good spook at nighttime, and almost all of us have childhood memories of sitting around a campfire with our friends, telling scary stories. There's a strange shared pleasure in group fear. Still, for all of the tales we heard about killers with hooks for hands watching us from the dark tree line beyond the fire pit, none of us ever really believed they were true, or that we were ever in any real danger. Well, had we heard about this next case, we all might have felt a little less secure around those campfires growing up. This is Tulsa's most infamous cold case, the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders. It was 1977, and camp season had just started in Oklahoma. Camp Scott was one of the finest Girl Scout camps in the state, and was celebrating its 50th anniversary. Based 50 kilometers outside of Tulsa, it boasted 410 acres of land, with its very own creek, and clusters of platform tents spread out among the trees. A little slice of heaven on earth for any nature-loving kid. In preparation for the big camp-out of the season, the counselors and counselors in training held a training session by themselves to ensure everyone knew what they were doing, and that all of the young scouts would be totally safe during the week-long break. During this training exercise, one counselor brought along a box of donuts to share out during the evening, which she left with her personal belongings. After returning from the day's activities, she found that the box had been opened, and that all of the donuts were gone. In their place was a sinister note which said that 3 campers were going to be murdered. She took that sinister note to her supervisors, and they all brushed it off. Clearly this was just some tasteless prank, nothing to be concerned about, right? It was Sunday, June 12th, and the first buses full of Girl Scouts arrived at Camp Scott. School had just been let out for summer, so spirits were obviously high. The weather didn't match the youngsters' vibes though, what with it being a misty and rainy day. All of the scouts were split into age-appropriate groups and sent to their designated tents, each of which held about 4 to 6 campers. The rest of the evening was filled with a whole host of fun activities, ranging from archery, to swimming, to making s'mores around a campfire, and, of course, telling a few ghost stories while doing so. But the festivities of that first night were short-lived, as the weather took a turn for the worse, and a sudden thunderstorm forced everyone to run back to their tents. There, they would be safe from the elements, but not from the unknown person who had been watching them the whole day. The Kiowa unit of tents was arranged in a horseshoe pattern, with a campfire and common area in the center. What made the Kiowa unit a little different was that it had an extra tent, tent number 8, which was situated a little further back from all the other tents, much closer to the trees. That, paired with the heavy rain and complete darkness, made it difficult for the Kiowa unit's counselor to see into tent number 8. 6 a.m. on the 13th, and one of the counselors woke up early to go and shower. As she cut through the trail that led to the bathhouse, she made a gruesome and heartbreaking discovery. 3 sleeping bags were lying in the middle of the trail, piled on top of one another. Bewildered, she unzipped the top bag. After doing so, she ran back to the camp and told the other counsellors what she had just found. The 3 sleeping bags contained the bodies of Laurie Lee Farmer, Michelle Heather Goose, and Doris Denise Miller, 8, 9, and 10, respectively. All 3 had been beaten to death with a flashlight found at the scene. Whoever had taken their lives had also done other things to them, which I can't bring myself to talk about in this video. I'm sure you can imagine what. None of their parents could have predicted what would happen to their daughters when they dropped them off for what was supposed to be a fun-filled break. The camp was of course immediately evacuated, and sniffer dogs were brought in to track down evidence. Here's what was found. A footprint belonging to a man who wore a size 9.5 was imprinted in blood found in tent number 8. There was a single, unknown fingerprint found on the lens of the flashlight which was used to hit the victims. A local in the area also reported hearing, quote-unquote, quite a bit of traffic on a small remote road between the camp and his property between 2:30 and 3 a.m. That appears to be the time that the murders took place. Detectives started scouring Oklahoma for suspects and set their sights on a man called Gene Leroy Hart, a guy with a sordid reputation to say the least. He'd been in and out of jail for a bunch of different offences over the years, and was on the run after a successful prison break. His family home was only 1 mile away from Camp Scott, so, needless to say, he knew the area well. He was found hiding out in a Cherokee medicine man's house later that same year, and was taken to trial, with the sheriff himself claiming to be 1000% certain he was guilty of taking the scouts' lives. Despite that, things just didn't add up. For instance, Hart didn't wear a 9.5 shoe. It also wasn't his fingerprint on the flashlight. He had a solid alibi, and various other pieces of evidence pointed to him not being the perp. DNA evidence at the scene would later be analysed, and the results showed that the odds of Hart being the killer were 1 in 7,700. Accusations started to be made about him being framed. The jury acquitted him. Still, Hart was sent back to the same prison he had escaped from. He still had 305 of a 308-year sentence to finish. He only served 2 of those, however, as he died in 1979 of a heart attack after lifting weights for an hour in the exercise yard. So yeah, if you're not in great shape, make sure to take it easy. If Hart wasn't responsible for the Girl Scout murders though, who was? Well, this all happened over 40 years ago now, and the case remains unsolved. Investigators still don't know if they're looking for one guy or several. As such, the who, what and why are likely to remain unknown for a long time. There's a plethora of theories floating around, but no smoking gun to speak of. I still believe the murders will be solved, said a childhood friend of Laurie's, many years after the incident. I believe somewhere out there, someone knows something. I hope they realise it's time they came forward. As a side note, 2 of the victims' families sued the camp for $5 million, claiming they'd been negligent by ignoring the threatening note in the donut box. By a 9-3 vote, jurors decided in favour of the camp. Born and raised in Manchester, New Hampshire, Lorraine Ann Rann lived a pretty ordinary life for a young teenager. A student at Parkside Junior High, she made good grades and was well liked by her classmates. Back in 1980, she lived with her mother Judith in a 3rd-floor apartment on Merrimack Street. On April 26th of that year, Judith was out of town with her boyfriend. He was a professional tennis player and was taking part in a big tournament. Usually Lorraine would have to join them, but this particular evening, she asked if it would be okay to stay home alone. Judith agreed, saying that she'd be back around midnight and to stay out of trouble. That night, Lorraine secretly invited 2 of her best friends over to the apartment to hang out. 1 male, 1 female. The 3 of them sat around drinking Lorraine's mother's wine and having a good night. Sometime into the evening, however, the male friend said he could hear voices coming from the hallway outside the apartment. Worried that it was Lorraine's mother coming home early and that they were about to be caught drinking, he hurried out the back door. Lorraine locked the door behind him. Well, Judith didn't come in, so it clearly wasn't her making the noises outside. The two young ladies, now alone, thought nothing of the sounds their male friends supposedly heard, and they both went back to drinking and enjoying themselves. Sometime around 1 AM, Lorraine's mother Judith finally arrived back home. She noticed that the light bulbs in the hallway on all 3 floors of the apartment building had been unscrewed and everything was dark. Now that was strange. Stranger still, the front door to her apartment was already unlocked. She entered and popped her head into Lorraine's room. There, she saw her sleeping in her bed. Exhausted, Judith got into her own and fell asleep. The next morning, Judith made a horrific discovery. The girl sleeping in Lorraine's bed wasn't Lorraine. It was her friend who had passed out from all of the wine. Lorraine was gone. Her clothes, brand new sneakers, and purse were in the living room, and the back door was wide open, something Judith hadn't noticed when she'd arrived home. The friend said that she had last seen Lorraine sleeping on the couch. Judith remembered the unscrewed light bulbs in the apartment hallways, and immediately she imagined the worst. She called the authorities immediately. 3 months passed by, and Lorraine was still missing. On October 1st, her mother Judith found that she had been charged for 3 California phone calls. She didn't have any friends or relatives who lived in Cali. 2 of the calls had been made from a motel in Santa Monica to another motel in Santa Ana. The 3rd call was placed to a teen support hotline. Judith was sure it was her daughter who had made those calls. The doctor who operated the hotline at first denied knowing anything about it, but in 1985, he changed his story. This doctor said that runaway girls occasionally visited his wife at their home for intimate health checkups, and that at around that time in 1980, one of the young women may have been from New Hampshire. He said that a woman named Annie Sprinkle may have more information about Lorraine's vanishing. The cops tracked her down. Annie Sprinkle was formerly a movie star of the more explicit variety, let's put it like that, and detectives sifted through all of her movies in an attempt to spot Lorraine. They found no evidence linking Sprinkle to Lorraine's disappearance. A private investigator hired by Lorraine's mother also learned that a man known only as Dr. Z may have used one of the aforementioned California motels to make several movies using underage actors, though ultimately this lead also resulted in nothing. It's never been categorically proven that Lorraine was ever at those motels, or that she made those 3 phone calls. For years after Lorraine disappeared, Judith frequently received mysterious phone calls. They always came at around 3:45 AM, and the caller would only breathe into the receiver. The frequency of these calls always increased around the Christmas holidays, and the unidentified person on the other end of the line never said a word. The identity of this mystery caller remains unknown to this day. 5 years after Lorraine's disappearance, the male friend who was hanging out at her apartment that fateful night took his own life. He was never considered a suspect in Lorraine's disappearance. Perhaps the strangest thing about this case is this. 6 weeks after Lorraine's disappearance, Denise Denault, a young woman who lived only 2 blocks away from Lorraine, went missing from a bar in Manchester. Despite their age difference, Denise and Lorraine closely resembled each other. That seems like a massive coincidence. Could the 2 cases be linked in some way? This picture shows what Lorraine might look like now if she's still alive. She stands at 5'4", has brown hair, blue eyes, and a prominent scar on her upper leg. If you have any information pertaining to her case, please contact the Manchester Police Department. This is a bit of a crazy one. The man in this photo is Franklin Delano Floyd. In 1974, he married a woman named Sandy Chipman, who already had 4 children of her own. Floyd invited Sandy and her children to move into his home in Dallas, Texas. For a brief time, they were happy, but then, in 1975, Sandy was sentenced to 30 days in jail for writing bad checks. During that time, she left her children in the custody of Floyd. Pretty natural thing to do, right? Strangely, her husband didn't come to visit her while she was incarcerated. Upon release, she returned to the family home in Dallas, Floyd was nowhere to be found. He had gone, and what's more, he had taken 2 of Sandy's children with him. Her eldest child, Suzanne, and her youngest, Philip. To this day, Philip has never been found, and it's unknown what happened to him. The girl pictured here with Floyd, however, is Suzanne, and we know what happened to her. Floyd had taken her to start a new life with, and this photo was taken shortly after they moved. He claimed Suzanne as his own biological daughter and changed both of their names. He raised her as his own. In 1989, Floyd married another woman called Tonya Hughes. She also already had a son named Michael. Floyd and Tonya had a strange relationship, to say the least. He wasn't the gentlest of husbands, put it like that, and despite being a smart girl who earned a full scholarship to study aerospace engineering, Tonya didn't go to college and instead became a dancer of the more risque variety. When Floyd discovered his wife was secretly having an affair with a college student, he became enraged. One evening, soon after her affair was discovered, Tonya mysteriously lost her life after being hit by a car. There were no witnesses, and the driver sped away without even trying to help her. At the time, Floyd wasn't suspected of anything, but is now considered to have been the man behind the wheel that fateful night. Now that Tonya was out of the picture, Floyd tried to adopt her son, Michael, but was denied custody. Floyd wasn't biologically related to Michael, and what's more, had placed him in foster care after Tonya's untimely demise. But now he wanted him back, and the courts weren't going to give him to him. As such, Floyd subsequently walked into Michael's school in the middle of the day, and, with a loaded weapon in his hand, forced the principal to take him to Michael's classroom. He then took Michael and the principal to his pickup truck and drove off with both of them. He ditched the principal in a wooded area, handcuffing him to a tree. Michael was never seen again, and, just like Philip, it's unknown what happened to him. In 2015, Floyd actually confessed to taking Michael's life the same day he took him from the school, though that claim remains unsubstantiated, as the boy's remains have never been recovered. The craziest part about that whole story I just told you? Floyd's second wife, Tonya Hughes, was actually the young girl he had stolen from his first wife, the youngster in this photograph, Suzanne Chipman. Like I said, he had changed her name and raised her as his own. Their relationship was more than that of a father and daughter, however. When she was of marrying age, he took her as his wife, and despite her good grades at school, forced her to start working as a dancer to earn money. At one point, she ended up running away with her high school boyfriend, with whom she had Michael, her son, but Floyd tracked them both down and took her back. As an interesting side note, when one of Tonya's co-workers at the dance club, Cheryl Comesso, reported Tonya for misstating her income and lost her government benefits, Comesso mysteriously disappeared. That was in 1989. 97 photographs were later discovered of Comesso, bound and beaten. Her skeletal remains were later found in 1995, with 2 shots in the back of her skull. Her slaying was linked to Floyd and Tonya, likely a revenge hit. Floyd was eventually apprehended 2 months after taking Michael from the school, and for his life of sin was given the death penalty. As it stands, that sentence is yet to be carried out. Franklin Delano Floyd is currently 77 years old. Fahim Saleh was a young man with big ideas. Described by his friends as the Elon Musk of the developing world, he started his first business while he was still in high school. He then went on to co-found 3 multi-million-dollar companies in Bangladesh, Nepal, and Nigeria. But despite achieving such success, Fahim wasn't the type of guy to just cash out and live a party lifestyle. Instead, he turned his sights to the land of opportunity, America, where he founded a Manhattan-based venture capital firm in 2018. By the start of this year, his estimated net worth was around $150 million. With so much cash in his coffers, the only limited resource this young CEO had was time. Unfortunately, that resource was about to run out. On July 14th, 2020, Fahim's sister went to his luxury $2 million apartment in New York to check up on him. Fahim's neighbors had contacted her the day prior, saying they heard loud screaming coming from his place. Since he wasn't picking up his phone, she went over to see what all the commotion was about. When she opened the door, she was immediately hit by a nauseating, metallic smell. She stepped inside and noticed something on the ground. It didn't quite register at first, but after a moment, she realized what she was looking at. It was Fahim's torso, lying next to an electric power saw. His head, arms and legs had been cut off and placed into garbage bags elsewhere in the apartment. Investigators said that the young entrepreneur had been butchered the night before, and that Fahim's sister had likely interrupted the killer's cleanup job. Whoever had taken her brother's life had more than likely escaped through the back entrance when he realized she was coming inside. Once news broke about Fahim's murder, the tech world went into shock. Theories started to fly around about who had taken his life. Could this have been some sort of organized hit? On his way to the top, Fahim had probably made his fair share of enemies, and definitely his fair share of competitors. Was this simply a robbery gone wrong? When you live in such a fancy condominium, you're bound to attract the eyes of some evil people, right? One of the first things the detectives did was check the complex's security tapes. What they found was of extreme interest. On the night of his death, Fahim was captured on CCTV entering the building with a man dressed entirely in black, including a black face mask. This unknown individual was carrying a briefcase. The two men entered the key-secured elevator that led to Fahim's 7th floor apartment. When the door to the elevator opened, Fahim could be seen struggling with the man in black before being forced into his flat. So, who was behind Fahim's untimely demise? Well, this has to be one of the shortest mysteries I've ever covered, as it thankfully only took 3 days to crack. On July 17th, Fahim's assistant, Tyrese Haspil, was arrested and charged with the slaying. It came to light that Tyrese had recently been caught stealing $90,000 from Fahim and was subsequently fired. Rather than going to the authorities, Fahim gave Tyrese an opportunity to pay back the money and avoid criminal charges. By all accounts, Fahim was a pretty nice guy who liked to give people a chance, and especially young folks. In this instance, however, he shouldn't have, as Tyrese responded by masking up, following his former boss into his apartment building, and using a taser to incapacitate him before stabbing him several times in his apartment. He then used the electric saw that he had brought in his briefcase to slice up Fahim into easily disposable pieces. Tyrese was far from a mastermind, however, as he had used his own credit card to buy the saw and the taser, both of which were found at the scene since he ran from the apartment after Fahim's sister came. Their serial numbers were linked to his purchases, and he was also captured on CCTV shopping for them, as well as shopping for cleaning supplies. As it stands, Tyrese has pleaded not guilty to taking Fahim's life, though with so much evidence against him, it seems like a pretty open and shut case. Regardless, I had to include this one for how recent and grisly it is. Now, if you'll excuse me, before the next entry, I have to return some videotapes. Let's explore a mystery that's come to be known as the Chinese Hinterkaifeck. All you true crime fans out there will know what that means. On the morning of December 27th, 2007, 2 workers arrived for work at a family lime factory in Huanggang City, China. What they were confronted with when they opened the doors that day is hard to imagine. 8 of their co-workers, some of them their family members, were lying in various locations around the factory, completely butchered. They first discovered their boss's wife lying in a pool of her own blood at the gate of the lime kiln, her throat slashed open. Nearby was her husband, their boss, who appeared to have been stabbed multiple times in the neck and face. The 2 men desperately ran to the dormitory, hoping to find survivors. They only found more horror. Inside the dorms were the bodies of 5 more workers, including a married couple and their 9-year-old child. Detectives later found one final body in a ditch outside the factory. This individual was found near a motorcycle, and it seems likely he was trying to escape the carnage before being chased down and killed. Perhaps he crashed into the ditch by accident, or succumbed to a wound he sustained. Either way, his body too was full of puncture wounds. nothing was taken from the factory. The investigators decided that the whole killing spree must have taken place between 8 PM the following night and 8 AM the morning they were discovered by the two men. It was determined that those two men only survived because they had their own local housing to go home to, and, unlike the other non-local workers, didn't have to sleep at the factory, a common practice in China. What boggles my mind most about this case, though, is that all 8 workers were killed by one perp, and they all died by the same blade. Can you imagine taking the lives of 8 people consecutively like that? How much rage and hate you'd have to have inside you? What on earth was this psycho's motivation? It appears as if he had a clear understanding of the factory's layout and knew to strike when the neighbouring cement factory was being particularly noisy so that nobody outside would hear the workers' screams. Perhaps he was a former worker who had a vendetta against the owner. Perhaps there was only one intended victim and everyone else was just collateral. The use of a knife makes it seem like the killer had a personal grievance to settle. But keep in mind that firearms are hard to come by in China, and slayings there often involve a more personal or creative instrument. For instance, one of the province's most infamous crimes was the murder of 17 via tractor in 2010. Still, how was this perp able to take out 8 people without anyone overpowering him or escaping? Did he attack them stealthily? Hold one of them captive for compliance? Was he an experienced assassin? Was he potentially working with the guy on the motorcycle, but turned against him in the end? In the weeks prior to it, the workers at the factory had reported that some of their possessions were disappearing and then reappearing in random places, as if somebody was coming in and moving them. Could this have been the work of the killer, messing with his future victims? In the 5 years leading up to this case, Chinese forensics and analysis improved leaps and bounds, and the investigators were able to determine that their suspect was 5'5" and wore EU size 40 leather shoes. Despite learning that information, the investigation turned up no suspects, and all these years later, the authorities have no clue who took the lives of those 8 workers, or why they did what they did. Some of you might already be aware of the Johnny Gosch mystery, but for those of you who haven't ventured down this particular rabbit hole yet, I can assure you that it's full of twists and turns, and it's one you're likely to get lost down. 38 years ago, on the morning of September 5th, 1982, Johnny Gosch, a 12-year-old from Iowa, left his house before dawn to start his paper route. He was delivering papers to the good people of West Des Moines. Johnny usually woke up his father to join him, but that particular Sunday morning, he instead snuck off without him and brought the family's miniature dachshund, Gretchen, for company. He was seen by other paper carriers picking up his newspapers that morning. At some point between 6 and 7 AM, while delivering those papers, Johnny disappeared without a trace and has never been seen or heard from again. Or has he? Let's go over the details. Just before he went missing, 2 local residents reported seeing Johnny talking with an unknown man in a blue Ford Fairmont with Nebraska plates, though they hadn't committed that number plate to memory. There appeared to be another man in the passenger seat. Neither of them could hear what Johnny was talking about with this man. It appeared as if the man in the car had stopped Johnny to ask for directions, though the witnesses can't be sure since they were only watching from their bedroom windows. Either way, they both said that something didn't feel right about the interaction, and that Johnny seemed to get spooked. One of these neighbours said that afterwards, as Johnny cycled off back towards his home, the car began following him. The other neighbour who witnessed this underwent hypnosis in an effort to remember the license plate number, though sadly, he never was able to remember it. "I keep hoping I'll wake up in the middle of the night and see that number on the license plate as distinctly as night and day," said the neighbour. But that hasn't happened. Realising that Johnny had gone off by himself, and that a local resident had called complaining about their morning paper not being delivered, Mr Gosch, Johnny's father, immediately went out searching for him along his usual route. It was then that he found Johnny's wagon full of newspapers, abandoned 2 blocks away from their family home. Gretchen, the family dog, was also found alone on a different street. There was no sign of Johnny anywhere. Fearing the worst, his father contacted the police immediately and reported his son missing. Unfortunately, the authorities were slow to react. procedure at the time was that Johnny had to be gone for at least 72 hours before he could be classified as a missing person, a frustrating policy that, thankfully, is no longer in place today. To begin with, the cops assumed Johnny was simply a runaway. That didn't make any sense to anyone that knew the kid. By all accounts, he had a happy home life and was a level-headed young man who showed absolutely no signs of wanting to run off by himself. Soon, the investigators came around to the idea that someone had taken him. 2 months passed with no sign of Johnny. Then, suddenly, there was a report in Oklahoma of a young boy screaming to a woman, "I'm Johnny Gosh! Help me!" This young boy was then dragged away by 2 unknown men. Noreen, Johnny's mother, believes that based on the boy's description, this was indeed her son. In the years that followed, little other evidence was ever collected by the detectives, and there were no other leads of any kind. It was like poor Johnny had just faded away. His parents took matters into their own hands, and hired several private investigators to turn up whatever they could. They were even able to get their son's face plastered on milk cartons across the USA. Ultimately, this turned up no new information. 2 years later, another kid from that same neighborhood also went missing under suspicious circumstances, leading many people to draw a connection between the 2 cases. So far this sounds like a pretty standard missing persons case, right? But here's where things take a strange and interesting turn, and where the rabbit hole becomes that little bit deeper. According to Johnny's mother, Noreen, almost 15 years after her son's disappearance, in March 1997, at around 2:30 AM, she was awoken by a loud knock on her front door. Startled as one would be, she looked through the peephole to see who was waiting outside. She saw 2 blurry figures. One of them spoke. "Mum, it's me, Johnny. Can I come in?" Noreen couldn't believe her ears, and as they adjusted, she couldn't believe her eyes either. It was Johnny standing outside, now no longer a boy, but a 27-year-old man. She said there was no mistaking that it was him, and when she opened the door, he revealed a unique birthmark on his chest, proving his identity. Apparently, he was accompanied by another, unidentified man. "We talked for about an hour or an hour and a half," said Noreen. "He was with another man, but I have no idea who the person was. Johnny would look over to the other person for approval to speak. He didn't say where he was living or where he was going." That night, Johnny asked his mother for help and told her that he had indeed been trafficked when he was younger, and that he had now escaped and was in hiding, that his life was still in danger, and that he couldn't stay. Johnny and the unidentified man left just before sunrise, and Noreen never heard from her son again after that. Question is, did this visit genuinely happen, or did a grieving Noreen simply imagine the entire encounter? Could it have been some kind of sick, well-researched prank? That all remains unclear. In 2000, Noreen published a book that detailed her supposed encounter with her son, titled "Why Johnny Can't Come Home." Then, in 2006, she reported that a set of photographs had been left on her doorstep. She notified the authorities and posted some of the pictures on her website. One photo shows 3 young lads, bound and gagged. Another shows what appears to be a young Johnny, again gagged and tied up, with a branding on his shoulder. Who had sent these pictures? 12 days after they arrived on her doorstep, the Des Moines police station received this anonymous letter. "Gentlemen, someone has played a reprehensible joke on a grieving mother. The photo in question is not one of her son, but of 3 boys in Tampa, Florida, about 1979-1980, challenging each other to an escape contest. There was an investigation concerning that picture made by the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office. No charges were filed, and no wrongdoing was established. The lead detective on the case was named Zalva. This allegation should be easy enough to check out." Nelson Zalva was indeed a real officer, and said that whoever had written the letter was telling the truth, that the first photo was of some kids just playing a game. He had seen it and investigated it before. However, that other photo, the one showing what appeared to be Johnny, was new. He'd never seen it before. No one has ever conclusively identified who the boy in the photo is, and whether or not he was just playing a game too. Noreen believes wholeheartedly that it's Johnny. More photos would arrive on her doorstep over the years, some of them being confirmed hoaxes. Stills from horror movies, and fakes made by sick losers tormenting a bereaved mother. Some of them, though, remain unidentified. Noreen's posted most of them online, in hopes that someone might come forward with information about them, in hopes that they'll somehow lead her to the truth. Theories about what happened to Johnny are numerous and varied, ranging from him being taken by a ring of high-profile predators to be sold, to him simply being murdered by an opportunist, to a whole load of other possibilities. Honestly, this rabbit hole is deeper than the Mariana Trench, so it's no wonder there are so many opinions about it. There are loads of documentaries and podcasts about Johnny's vanishing online, so I'd recommend checking those out for a more detailed analysis of the case. Ultimately, despite Noreen's belief that her son visited her all those years after disappearing, nobody really knows whether Johnny's alive or dead. Well, somebody knows, I suppose. Born Nur Mazna Ismail in 1956, Mona Fandi grew up in Kangar, Perlis, and from a young age craved attention. She loved nothing more than singing and water ballet, and had big dreams of becoming a global superstar. When she met Mohammed Noor Effendi Abdul Rahman, her biggest fan with enough cash to fund her dream, Mona wasted no time in getting him to put a ring on her finger. Now with a wealthy husband to pay for studio time, she was able to release a full-length pop album called Diana. She even managed to get onto several TV shows and sing a few tracks for the whole nation to hear. Link to one of those performances down in the bio. Mona's beautiful melodies and dulcet tones quickly captured the hearts of Malaysians and people everywhere, and within months was the most successful artist in the country's history. Here's what she would have wanted to happen. In reality, her record was actually a flop, and it quickly became apparent that her career as a pop singer wasn't going to take off like she expected. But not making a name for herself wasn't an option for Mona. If she wasn't going to have fame, she was going to have infamy. As such, she hung up her microphone and started dabbling in witchcraft. You know, as you do. This very drastic change in direction proved to be surprisingly lucrative for Mona. She started advertising her services as a bomo, basically a local shaman, and over time, she built up a client base. In exchange for an extortionate amount of money, she'd perform a whole host of maleficent services. Curse her clients' enemies, gift them lucky charms, extend their lives. Whatever they needed, she knew a ritual that would make it happen. At least that's what she had people believing. And not just any people. She had some truly powerful, high-profile clients. Real VIPs, including politicians from the country's ruling party. Pretty soon, she was able to afford things like luxury cars, huge mansions, the finest jewelry money could buy. Mona had finally become the success that she had always wanted to be. But there was one thing missing. Her name was known and celebrated only by an elite, chosen few, not by the whole nation. That was all about to change. In 1993, Malaysian politician Mazlan Idris approached Mona and asked for her help. Mazlan wanted to become chief minister and believed that with the help of Mona's black magic, he'd get the post. He offered her 2.5 million ringgit for her services, about 600,000 American dollars. He gave her 500,000 ringgit as a down payment, and 10 land titles as surety for the rest. Well, of course, Mona agreed to bless him, and this blessing came in 2 parts. Firstly, she gave Mazlan a talisman consisting of a magic cane and a headpiece, which both supposedly once belonged to Indonesian President Sukarno. She told him that these items would make him invincible. Secondly, she told Mazlan to come to her home and take part in a so-called cleansing ritual. According to Mona, this would purify Mazlan's spirit and ensure him the chief minister position. The superstitious Mazlan agreed. Mazlan arrived at Mona's home in Raub, Pahang. He found her waiting inside, along with her husband, Mohammed, and one of their assistants, Juraimi Hassan. With candles lit and the mood set, Mona told Mazlan to lie on the floor. She slowly placed flowers on his body, chanting as she did to repel any negative spirits. So far, so good. When she'd finished placing the flowers, she told Mazlan to close his eyes and wait for, quote-unquote, the money to fall from the sky. Well, that sounded pretty good. He closed his eyes and waited. But it wasn't money that came raining down upon him. Without warning, Jeremy, Mona's assistant, chopped off Maslin's head with an axe that she had just handed him. It went rolling across the floor. The talisman of invincibility clearly didn't work. Mona, along with her husband and assistant, then cut Maslan into 18 pieces, skinned them, and buried most of him in a storeroom near the house. Some parts of him were never found, and it's theorized that the trio may have eaten some of Maslan's remains as part of their own shamanistic ritual. After this brutal act, Mona and her accomplices went on with their lives as if nothing had happened. Only difference was they now all had a bunch of extra cash in their pockets. They all went on spending sprees, and Mona herself bought a Mercedes-Benz and invested in a facelift, no doubt hoping that her career as a pop star might actually take off someday. It wasn't long before Maslan's disappearance was noticed, however. Still, even though he was officially reported missing, for a while the authorities had no leads to work with. That soon changed. In July of that year, Mona's assistant, Jeremy, was picked up by the cops on unrelated charges, and, while off his head on who knows what, got confused and told them everything that the trio had done that fateful night. He even led them to the storeroom where they'd hidden what was left of Maslan. His remains had been buried 6 feet deep and covered with a cement seal. Still, that's not much use if your accomplice can't stop himself from confessing. It wasn't long before investigators tracked down Mona and her husband as well, and soon a very public trial was underway. Mona quickly became the most talked about woman in all of Malaysia. She basked in the spotlight of it all, never hiding her face from the cameras, and almost always wearing glamorous and colourful dresses as she was paraded by guards to and from courtrooms. Rather than avert her eyes from onlookers, she instead smiled and posed as news teams snapped her photo, never missing an opportunity for her newly lifted face to make the front page of newspapers. On various occasions, she was overheard saying things like, "Looks like I have many fans." In her eyes, she was finally famous, a household name, albeit for one of the worst reasons possible. After 2 months, a verdict was finally returned. It took the jury just over an hour to reach their decision. All 3 of the group were found guilty and sentenced to death. Mona's reaction to hearing her life would soon end? She said, "I'm happy, and thank you to all Malaysians." She left the courtroom, smiling. The day before their sentence was carried out, Mona and her accomplices requested a last meal of KFC. She met with her family one last time and said her goodbyes. Then, on the 2nd of November 2001, at 5:59 AM, Mona, her husband, and her assistant, Jeremy, were all hanged. Her final chilling words? "Aku takkan mati." I will never die. She was completely calm during the entire ordeal and was reportedly smiling when the black hood was placed over her head. 2 of her abandoned mansions still stand and are frequently visited by local ghost hunters, all hoping to meet with the wandering spirit of Mona Fandi, Pahang's most notorious shaman. Let's take a trip in both geography and time and examine a truly bizarre incident. Evora, Portugal, 2nd of November, 1959. From his headmaster's office at a local college, Dr. Guedes do Amaral noticed something strange just floating far off in the sky outside his window. It was a bright blue, cloudless day, and this seemingly metallic sphere that was just hovering in the sky was completely out of place. Then again, his old eyes weren't as sharp as they once were, so, along with some other teachers, he set up a telescope in the courtyard and took a more magnified look at the thing. As he examined it, he could hardly believe what he was seeing. There, in the sky, was a whitish blue, shimmering object, moving in a completely unnatural way. It would hover in place for long periods, and then zip in a random direction at what Dr. Amaral described as a speed that defied the laws of physics. He knew this definitely wasn't a bird or a plane. It had no wings or propellers to speak of, just a metallic orb suspended in space. As they were observing it, it vanished into thin air. Then, without warning, and seemingly out of nowhere, another, much larger flying object appeared above them. It was physically similar to the first, apart from the fact that it was several times bigger and comprised of 2 spheres instead of 1. The top sphere was solid, but the one beneath it moved in a wavy, jellyfish-like motion. This one too would just hover in place before moving at a ridiculously quick pace somewhere else. Occasionally it dropped altitude, only to shoot back up into the sky at record-breaking speed, going so high as to almost disappear from their view. Dr. Amaral asked his nearby co-workers and students to look through his telescope and confirm that he wasn't going senile. Much like him, they too couldn't believe their eyes, nor could the hundreds of other witnesses across town who also saw the oscillating object above them. After approximately 30 minutes of loitering, the unidentified flying object silently sped off and disappeared. The astonishment of the town's residents soon turned to unease when a strange, cobweb-like substance started falling from the sky down upon them. Long strands of this white, stringy material rained down and formed in large clumps on the ground and rooftops. This still unidentified substance would later become known as angel hair rain. Dr. Amaral and his students examined the falling angel hair. At first, they theorized that it must be the work of some breed of flying spider dropping silky webs from above. Such things are exceptionally common in Australia and New Zealand, though admittedly very rare in Europe. Still, that didn't seem to make much sense. There's no way a whole army of spiders could have produced this much webbing, and there weren't any pesky arachnids visible anywhere. Dr. Amaral and his students tried to pick up some of the strange substance, only to realize that the hairs melted in their warm hands. During the 4 hours that it fell over the small provincial town, Dr. Amaral was able to scoop up a small clump of the white filaments into a petri dish. 62 miles away, a team of fighter pilots were preparing for takeoff at Portugal's Sintra airbase. Several of the pilots, including Captain Tomás Silva, noticed a strange, slimy substance forming on their canopies. It was the same white filaments that were falling over Evora, collecting on their jets like snow in winter. After washing off the substance and finishing their mission, Captain Tomás Silva called his father, Admiral Conceição Silva, an enthusiastic amateur physicist and astronomer, and asked him for his opinion on what the substance could be. Stumped, Admiral Silva himself called up his friend in Evora. That friend just so happened to be Dr. Amaral. Amaral said that the same substance had just fallen over his town too. They realized this must be a nationwide incident, and when Amaral said that he had successfully collected a sample, the two scientists quickly agreed to meet and examine it together. After magnifying the angel hair 120 times, both Amaral and Silva noticed something bizarre. There was a living organism under their microscope. On the hair was a 1 millimeter wide, yellow, unicellular creature with 10 slime-covered tentacles that expanded and moved. The thing's legs were so strong that they could actually lift up the slides that the creature was framed between slightly. It demonstrated defensive mechanisms like that of an animal. Neither of them had ever seen anything like this before in their professional careers. The only known animals to have a similar structure to the microscopic creature were certain types of jellyfish. Okay, so maybe this was some type of rare jellyfish from the deep ocean, but that doesn't explain how so many of them started falling from the sky on stringy cobwebs. Some scientists warily started speculating that the creatures could have come from a neighboring planet or from Earth's extra-atmospheric space. Others believed that the hair-like strands were vaporized meteor fragments. Given the time period, some speculated that this had something to do with a Cold War gas test. Again, given the time period, the Portuguese government was extremely authoritarian and nationalistic. The doctor's research was deemed to be against God, and any effort to publish his findings were thwarted. Dr. Amaral tried to translate his research and publish it internationally, but when he tried to do so, he was threatened with suspension. Both he and Admiral Silva were publicly shamed to the point where they both gave up trying to get others on board with their discovery. Unable to proceed with his research and feeling out of his depth, Dr. Amaral handed over the preserved specimens to the University of Lisbon, where they were further analysed. Still, Amaral himself never gave up looking into the angel hair and organism, and when he passed away in the 1990s, he left behind his large amount of research. He had collected hundreds of testimonials from other people who had seen the flying objects that morning in November, and in each case, the witnesses said that their sightings were followed by angel hair falling from the sky. He'd also learned that this so-called angel hair rain had been observed at several other points in history. 1561 in Germany, 1917 again in Portugal, 1898 in Montgomery, USA, 1952 in France, and 1954 in Italy. Still, it's unclear whether those incidents were the exact same as this. In 2008, an expert cell biologist was contacted to examine Dr. Amaral photos of the unknown creature found on the webs. The expert wrote, "This structure, or microorganism as some have called it, is still unknown to contemporary science. I was unable to identify a single structure akin to an earthly single-cell organism." So, there we have it. Surely the fact that the angel hair coincided with the appearance of the flying objects couldn't have been a coincidence. Then again, could there be a far more rational explanation for this mystery than just aliens? Of course. Like many scientists have noted, the structure of the creatures on the hair is extremely similar to young, microscopic jellyfish. How they came to fall from the sky is anyone's guess though. Perhaps they were scooped up in a whirlwind. Still, that doesn't account for the flying objects themselves, which were seen by hundreds of people just before the hair fell. Were they military in origin? Civilian? Or something more otherworldly? Sadly, we may never hear more from this case, due to the sad fact that the labs at the University of Lisbon burned down in the late 1970s, taking the original samples Dr. Amaral had collected with them. The only other sample that may exist was taken by a group of independent researchers, and has since mysteriously vanished. A huge shout out to Reddit user LucyCat Writes for their amazing overview of this case on the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Now, this case isn't one about a missing person, or an unsolved murder, or anything like that. This one isn't so much sinister as it is strange. The mystery of Kenji Iwamura. On July 24th, 1989, two mountaineers went missing in the remote wilderness of Hokkaido as they made their way towards the Asahidake mountain. Search and rescue helicopters were of course dispatched to the area, and while circling around the Chibetsugawa River, they spotted an SOS sign below, made from tree logs. They focused their search efforts around there, and found the two missing adventurists only 2 kilometers away. Their self-made SOS sign had worked. Only, they hadn't made it. The two men told the rescuers they hadn't constructed any such sign, and the fact that it was there had just simply been a massive coincidence. Understandably confused, the rescuers decided to check the area immediately around the sign. Someone had made it after all. Nearby, they discovered something shocking. The skeletal remains of an unknown man. His SOS sign had saved 2 people, but had failed to save him. Seeing how he was just bones which had been gnawed on by wild animals, it was clear he'd perished a long time before. His remains were examined, and it was concluded that he had broken several bones shortly before he died. He'd likely had an accident while hiking. Alone and unable to get back to civilization, he either starved or froze. A driver's license under the sign identified him as 25-year-old Kenji Iwamura, an outdoorsman and train enthusiast from Aichi Prefecture. Kenji had been missing for 5 years. Aside from the coincidental finding of 2 men thanks to his own unsuccessful SOS sign, there are several things that make Kenji's case so unusual and noteworthy. Firstly, there was a tape recorder found inside a backpack next to Kenji's body, along with several tapes. Most of these were just anime soundtracks, but when the authorities played one of them in particular, they heard a recording of Kenji's frightened voice, yelling for help, sounding out every syllable extremely slowly and unnaturally. Translated, this is what Kenji said in the tape. "I can't move from atop this cliff. SOS! Please help! I'm near where the helicopter was originally, and I can't move further due to bamboo brush being in the way. Please help me out of here." Why Kenji recorded this into his tape recorder when there was no way of transmitting it is unknown, though some people have speculated that he might have been trying to save his voice, and so recorded the message so he could play it constantly, just in case someone happened to pass by. He likely knew that he would eventually grow too weak to talk on his own. The real question, however, is this. What helicopter was he talking about in the tape? Kenji had been staying at a log cabin and told the owner that he was just going on a quick hike along the relatively short Asahidake mountain trail. He certainly hadn't got there by helicopter. Also in the recording, Kenji said that he was stuck atop a cliff, but his remains were found near the aforementioned Chibetsugawa River, far away from the only cliff in the area. How did he come to be there if he couldn't walk and was trapped by the bamboo brush? Most strange of all is this. The SOS sign itself was made from very large logs. The sign was stacked 3 logs high, and at its tallest point, reached 5 meters. Given his injured and weakened state, it's hard to believe he would have had the strength to create such a sign, especially since he was apparently too hurt to even walk. He would have had to collect all the heavy logs, carry them, and stack them. If he could do all that, why couldn't he get back to the nearby village? When Kenji was originally reported missing by the lodge's host, a search and rescue team went to go and find him, but failed to spot his SOS sign for some reason. That's despite the later rescuers looking for the 2 men spotting it very easily. Perhaps he made the sign too late to save himself. At least it eventually served its purpose, and who knows, Kenji's efforts may have just saved the lives of 2 strangers. So, what do you make of this one? How did Kenji make the SOS sign? Why was he found so far away from where he said he was in the tape? What helicopter was he talking about? And why weren't any rescuers able to find him when he first went missing? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. We all love a good Jane Doe mystery on this channel, so here's one I've never covered before. The Isdal woman is the name given to an unidentified body found at Isdalen in Bergen, Norway. She was found on November 29th, 1970. She was lying on her back with her clenched hands up by her torso. Isdalen literally translates to Ice Valley, so you can imagine how cold the area was. Still, there was no evidence of any campfire being made nearby. In spite of that, the front of her body and her clothes had been severely burned. Her face was so charred it was unrecognizable, though forensic artists were able to come up with this image showing what she likely looked like in life. Near her remains were a whole host of items, including an empty bottle of St. Halvard, a cheap brand of liquor, 2 plastic water bottles, a plastic passport container, some clothes, an umbrella, a purse, a matchbox, a watch, 2 earrings, and a ring. All the labels on these items that could have helped to identify her had been removed or rubbed off. Most interestingly, however, was that there were traces of burned documents around her body. A few days later, 2 suitcases linked to this unknown woman were found at Bergen Station. Inside them were clothes, again with their tags removed, wigs, cosmetics, medicine, maps and timetables, a notepad, and money in Norwegian, Belgian, British and Swiss currencies. 100 Deutsche marks were also found hidden in the lining of one of the cases. Curious. An autopsy was carried out on her body. It was determined that she died from a combination of phenobarbital and carbon monoxide. She had ingested around 50 to 70 sleeping pills, with more than 12 found scattered around the scene of her passing. What's more, her lungs contained a large amount of soot, which indicated one disturbing fact. She was still alive when she was burned. A large bruise on her neck could have been made after she had a fall, or perhaps after being struck by a blunt object. The last confirmed sighting of this woman alive was when she left her hotel room on November 23rd, 6 days before her remains were discovered. The hotel staff described her as attractive, with brown eyes and dark hair, though she reportedly often wore wigs. That lines up with the content of her suitcases. They said she appeared to be on guard during the entirety of her stay. She apparently smelled strongly of garlic. The woman had stayed in several other Bergen hotels before that one, and in each, she had changed her room multiple times after checking in. In several of the hotels, she had been overheard speaking with unknown people in German, English, and Flemish. After decoding her notepad entries, detectives learned that the Istal woman was quite the traveller. In the run-up to her mysterious end, she had travelled extensively around not only Norway, but Europe in general. Based on her handwritten check-in forms at the hotel she'd stayed at, they learned that she'd been using at least 8 different passports and aliases. The only consistent detail on all of these forms was that she listed her nationality as Belgian. Given the fact that this all happened at the height of the Cold War, it's been speculated that the Istal woman was a covert agent of some kind. That would account for her strange movements, which all just so happened to line up with the top secret trials for Penguin missiles. Not to mention, there were numerous other strange disappearances in Norway during those years, which were all later linked to international espionage. Ultimately, it was ruled by the authorities that the woman had simply taken her own life. That raised a lot of suspicions, given the facts of the case, and many people started claiming that the police were being pressured to cover up the real story. In 2005, when the investigation was reopened, a man came forward and said that he may have seen the woman a few days before her body was found. He says she was hiking along the hillside in Isdalen, surprisingly underdressed for such an activity, as if she had planned to be in the city and not in the ice valley. She was apparently walking ahead of 2 men dressed in coats. The witness thought about saying something to them, but didn't. He tried to report what he had seen at the local police station, but was told to forget about it. So, who was the Istal woman? A spy? A member of some professional, perhaps nefarious organization? A lonely woman who decided to end it all in the most elaborate way she could think of? The jury's out, I'm afraid. Still, this is an interesting Wikipedia article to read through for all you unsolved mystery lovers out there. It provides a great summary of the case, and is the perfect starting point to get you digging deeper into this case's rabbit hole. The best things happen in the dark.